this?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Perfect. For POIs, if you will, just turn on your camera and wave, or alternatively, just motion it in chat, and I'll try to respond or get to you. Cool. Give me 1 second. All right, speech starts in 3, 2, 1. This debate is simple. There's limited financial capital that international development organizations have. We think using it to fund a corrupt regime is necessarily bad. I'm going to do 3 things. First of all, I'm going to set up what the counterfactual on our side is, as well as what we likely support an alternative, along with what this debate is about. Second of all, I'm going to talk about why the trade-off exists and what the harms of that are in terms of long-run purposes of the international organization helping more countries. Finally, I'm going to talk about why this is important and acting as a deterrent mechanism to get corrupt regimes to an extent to reform. First of all, in terms of setup, there are a couple things I want to note here. First of all, rather than using this money to finance projects for natural extraction within these countries, we're willing to do things that are more direct in reaching the individuals on the ground. So things, for example, like projects to build schools that does not go through the corrupt regime, or like actors and companies that are affiliated with said corrupt regime, or for example, sponsoring NGOs so you're able to get more humanitarian aid or employment opportunities to individuals on the ground. We think the exact money opposition uses to fund these natural extraction projects are things we're going to use for these alternative mechanisms. The second thing I want to flag out is in the long run, if these corrupt regimes become less corrupt, for instance, we're obviously okay with funding them then, because to that end, they no longer become corrupt regimes. What then are the corrupt regimes we're talking about in this debate? We think, broadly speaking, these are regimes that are either like straight out dictatorships or pseudo-democracies that don't actually care about the mandate of individuals. So things, for example, like tampering of election results. Things, for example, like entrenching and embezzling money and therefore entrenching corruption, things of that nature. We think characteristically, what these corrupt regimes look like are oftentimes one regime in which you don't actually have the mandate of the entirety of the population, but you have the mandate of like some degree of small elite as a result, for example, you buying off the military junta in places like Venezuela, for example, or you just being able to get lobbyists to work with you, and as a result of that, you consolidate power therefore. What this also often means is you have massive amounts of state-owned businesses that are affiliated with the elite that are within the inner niche circles of the individuals who are in positions of power. So that's what this debate is about. First argument, therefore, why there's a trade-off in this debate and why the trade-off on opposition, therefore, is bad. Why is there a trade-off? I think there are 3 reasons why there's a trade-off. The first reason, quite intuitively, is just because there's like monetary like trade-offs. Like if you like spend money here, you can't spend money elsewhere. There are also like trade-offs in space. So like if you, for example, like build a mine, you can't build a school or any other thing on top of that mine. The second reason why there's a trade-off is because of political capital. So I think things, for example, like sponsoring corrupt regimes are relatively controversial. So it's far harder to push through. So to the point in which you try to push that through, it probably takes away from other non-controversial things. So for example, things like building schools, because the perception is you're already working with these regimes already. You're already using a lot of capital on this project. So it's unclear why we want to do anything else. I think it's also far harder, for instance, to do a lot of things with one specific country, because generally speaking, the individuals who support these development like organizations won't want you to just only invest in one country. As a result of that, there's some degree of trade-off therefore. The final reason why there's a trade-off is because of the limited transferability of things, for example, like natural extraction projects. The first reason why there's little transferability is just because like generally speaking, the individuals who end up working there, even in the best case of opposition, have very little mobility within like their own social life, right? So like as a coal miner, it's very difficult for you to, for example, gain other jobs because you're not equipped with other necessary skills. Or for example, if you just like work in a specific place that is only designated towards natural resource extraction, it's very difficult for you to find employment elsewhere because you have very little skills. The comparative when you invest into things, for example, like vocational training or things like education that more directly reach individuals, is that they're far more transferable in these skills they have and they become more utile. The second reason why there's higher transferability is also because like once the resource is gone, the mine kind of just becomes useless and you can't really do anything with that. The comparative when you do things like build schools, for example, or build roads and infrastructure is that these things eventually trickle down into individuals on the ground, and people on the ground can use it. And also it's relatively transferable and that more individuals and a higher magnitude of people have access. What then is the impact? The first impact, very simply, is that we use money and invest it into more meaningful things that in the long run is better because it helps more individuals writ large. So in terms of a utilitarian weighing of like magnitude, we probably benefit more individuals and therefore it's preferable. Second of all, things, for example, like education are uniquely more empowering in that it maximizes things like mobility. I also think it's generally speaking better because the issue of the comparative is that opposition cannot guarantee that the World Bank fund, for example, that goes into a developing country that is corrupt necessarily goes to help individuals on the ground. Because what likely happens per the characterization is that individuals on the top just like take that money, they only hire individuals from their own elite circles, and the money doesn't trickle down. The reason why that doesn't happen with the comparative is because things, for example, like schools and public utilities are things that everyone can access. Whereas like on their side of the house, the revenue you get from, for example, the project might just go towards the project of the pockets of the elite. That likely doesn't happen with things that are far more direct on our side of the house because you circumvent the issue of corruption and the embezzling of money. The final reason as to why there's a trade-off and why we're able to circumvent that is because the issue on their side is that you eventually deplete political capital in the long run. Because here's the issue. If it is true that these regimes are corrupt, what that means is they're probably going to do this project in a horrible way. So things, for example, like having little accountability that leads to things, for example, like fatal incidents. Things, for example, like them just like taking the money away, and therefore people within development organizations thinking as though like these are just like bad projects to invest in. The reason as to why then that is bad is because you disincentivize individuals to invest into development organizations in the first place because there's a perception that that money is not going to be used in a good way because you're funneling it down corrupt regimes anyways. The issue then as to why that is bad is because in the long run, you get far less money. The weighing here is simple. First of all, even if op can prove that this one opportunity and venture is good, if the perception people have is that you're using the money poorly and they don't invest, you harm your ability to help more countries in the long run, more money on our side because more people are more willing to invest, means that you generally speaking get more capital. That's generally speaking better. Before I go on to my second argument, I'll take CO.
Yeah, for international development organizations to even get funding in the first place, then people have to believe that the types of programs that they're implementing are going to lead to some ability for those countries to return on their loans. Why do they think that that is the case with education?
No, so I think like education is a lot more tangible and you can like monitor it like far more directly and the benefits of that are far more tangible. Like you see people going to schools, for example, you can't, for example, track where the profit of like you mining coal goes. Oftentimes it goes towards the pockets of the elites who are already entrenching power. Second argument then briefly, why this acts as a disincentive. There are three things under this. First of all, I think on their side, you entrench the power of individuals at the top and you make it harder to topple corrupt regimes for the very reason that you give them more money and more power, and there's very little accountability mechanism. Second of all, I think it's important to recognize that the issue right now with corrupt regimes is that they need to appease the inner circle of individuals, so like the military junta, for example, or people who like they're tight with because the elites or the individual in positions of power give them a lot of money. The issue is that you often cannot appease them and you cannot give them the money, which in turn gives you economic mandate to the point in which you don't have, for example, like money to give them. So that's important because to the point in which World Bank, for example, doesn't fund these institutions, you incentivize them to reform to an extent because they're now forced to change in order to get the economic mandate that is now lost because they don't have the ability to like extract minerals and therefore use that to pay off the individual elites. As a result of that, we also reform states on our side. Very happy to oppose.
Thank that speaker for their speech and call upon the leader of the opposition.
I am audible, right? Okay, Zoom says I am.
Yeah.
I want to talk about three things. Firstly, on what happens after you try to invest in all these resource extraction projects, and why it ultimately does not help the people or help development in any way by virtue of the fact that these regimes are corrupt. Secondly, on the alternatives that Op tries to say will be the comparative under the status quo. And third and finally, to reinforce the arguments that Ted already gave you about the possibility of having resource distributions and trade-offs in terms of what the World Bank or other organizations might be able to do. So firstly, what happens after you try to invest in these states? Because I think this is critical, because the entirety of opposition's argument hinges on the fact that if you have the World Bank handle these cases, this is able to improve the economic conditions of all these countries and reach the final goals of development. I think this is likely going to be untrue simply because it is corrupt, and there are many parts and institutional aspects of corrupt regimes that means that any kind of project that tries to run through the regime ultimately does not help the people. This is because we first proved that this is why these resources are likely going to be managed by the state, and this means that these states are able to very easily access avenues in which corruption can take place, because either one, they can directly help manage the project. You might allocate the project directly to the government to help manage. They may sell the contract to someone else, but ultimately they still have oversight over the project. Corruption is very simple to enact in all of these different cases. You just pay someone an extra amount, or you might skim some off the top. You might change numbers in the accounting tables a bit. I think the other case is that you have other big companies who are inside this country try to take over the project. The problem is many of these large actors, which are the only actors that can handle these large natural resource extraction projects because of the sheer scale and industrial necessity and complexity required in all these projects, these are likely going to be state-owned, or they're heavily linked to the state, because in most authoritarian and corrupt regimes, you require all these companies have a great incentive to link themselves to the state, because the state controls avenues of violence. Either that means the military or other security apparatus. So that means that if you don't listen to the state, they can literally shut you down or threaten your life or threaten other parts that you care about. Or it's just simpler and easier in your interest to build up a coalition with the state, because that means that you can influence legislation to make them turn a blind eye when you exploit your workers, or to turn a blind eye when you flim off other environmental regulations. This is where there is a symbiotic relationship between these big companies and these states. That means that this money ultimately still goes to the state anyways. Secondly, why is there an incentive for states to be corrupt, and how does this manifest? I think one, this ultimately doesn't help the people. I think you want to have a resource fronts, particularly when you are an authoritarian state that is likely economically struggling, since that's a characterization that we seem to all agree with. So the way in which you can maintain your hold on power obviously isn't to help the people, but to supply certain close groups that form the foundation of your power the necessary resources for you to continue to survive. This usually means the military. This usually means the big corporations that supply your interests, that can put down protests if there are massive Arab Spring protests that spring up again. This also means that you're giving out this money and you're giving out other forms of privileges and rights to all these major actors. Or secondly, there are parts of your internal governmental bureaucracy that you might want to give extra money to, just because you want to secure their loyalty. You want to decrease the possibility that they defect in the case of public protests. This is important because this also means that any kind of money that you get from resource extraction is not going to social welfare. It is not going to anyone who actually needs the help. It is only going to fueling and benefiting and bolstering the existing regime, which means that you're only helping the authoritarian regime instead of pressuring them to have any kind of change at all. So regardless of whether or not this resource extraction project is successful, it does not flow down to the regime, because that's not how they hold on to power. Second thing, why other programs are more important. Fine. I think that it is true that most World Bank institutions might not fund directly schools or like build schools, but they obviously do give out a lot of grants for the foundation of education projects. I think they give out a lot of grants, so not loans, but grants to developing countries that cannot possibly pay them back, or to other social enterprises. They supply grants, whether that means that it's funded through like the United States money or the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Not everything that the World Bank does is based on economic benefits, just because clearly some regimes are unable to supply back these loans. And if you only give money to countries that can pay back, obviously you're not doing your job as a development institution because many of these are so poor, and that's the reason why they can't pay you back. I think this just means that the World Bank is not giving out loans all the damn time. So this can manifest in things like iron pills or vitamin packages, or like supplying microloans to people. Obviously, people can probably pay back their microloans to a certain degree, even if some of them might default. Or agricultural research, like the agriculture project that was founded in 2010, I think, that was devoted to in researching more efficient ways of agriculture and implementing them in local farms. I think these are all things that you can do that directly help the people that do not go through the government. And these are ways in which you're able to ensure the development from the grassroots level without risking all this going to corrupt regimes. I think this is what is more important for the World Bank to do. This also sidesteps the entirety of like the POI come from closing, because I don't think like you get any return from these corrupt regimes anyways when you put like mines in these corrupt regimes that take money for their use and like report fake numbers to you. And I think secondly, it's also that you obviously have some degree of return. It's very clear where the benefits manifest when these children who are growing up in parts of rural Kenya might be able to grow up more healthy and better able to work, and therefore more productive and more better educated. I think it's also untrue that NGOs, etc., necessarily work with the government and therefore they are co-opted, because one, that's an operational nightmare if you as a regime that has like very little resources because you're poor tries to manage every single NGO that's running in your large country. Two, I think just because NGOs work within the rules and don't try to go like try to threaten the regime doesn't mean that they push their money to the regime anyways. They might try to work within the rules, but they're not corrupt in the same way that the government might be. Third and finally, on alternatives. I think this is symmetric. I acknowledge that these countries might want to go to China because they have better terms. I think China tends to have low interest rates as opposed to ridiculously higher interest rates. They also tend to have no strings attached, right? Even if they have high interest rates. Actually, before that, I'll take opening.
Look, surely just giving people a job and food in their belly is one of the biggest impacts in this debate.
You're not giving people a job and food in their belly if the entire scheme is going to be short-termist, that ultimately the money does not flow to the people. It might be a short-term job, but this isn't one that is going to be allocated to a lot of people. I also think a better way to do this is simply to foster the domestic, the grassroots level industries that most people actually access, not the people who live near the factories, but the people who live in particular villages and need microloans to set up their businesses or have fertilizers so they can have more farms. These can be done on either side. But like on China and all these things, right? This is symmetric. We acknowledge this. Like just even if China has higher interest rates, then like the most important thing about Chinese loans is that they don't care about politics. And this is most important to you as an authoritarian regime, because this is the way in which you can hold on to power. People aren't constantly pushing you to change, and you already supply some degree of, like, as they said in the POI, economic and jobs like benefits. So people are happy. So you only really care about the fact that China does not care about your politics. So this also means that what the question really is what the World Bank does with limited resources. And if it is true for all the reasons that Elo outlines for why the World Bank is a better alternative and why these countries want to turn to the World Bank, this means that there is even more of an incentive for these countries to try to change their own internal regimes if they want to get the World Bank loans. And if it's not true, then their entire argument about how the World Bank is better also does not work. We're very proud to propose.
Thank that speaker for their speech and call upon DLO.
Okay. I'll be starting in 3, 2, 1. We think resource economies are uniquely bad. So let's first talk about why we incentivize countries to diversify from resource economies on our side of the house, clashing with all of opening opposition. First of all, why do we think they're shit? One, they're inherently and structurally vulnerable to Dutch disease, which means that when you pull a huge amount of money into one particular industry, which is what opening opposition is standing for, this leads to inadvertent appreciation of your currency. This means that your exports unplannedly and shortly become a lot more expensive than you've intended them to, which means you lose a lot of the trade which is necessary for development that opening opposition stands for. But secondly, this is compounded by the fact that resource economies specifically incentivize corruption. First of all, they provide short-term large influxes of money, which make them a very good way to tip off your patronage networks and oligarchs necessary to sustain an autocratic regime. But secondly, it's very easy to set up a bloated state-run company to appoint people from the political party that you appoint for political loyalty, because the process of extracting and selling resources is quite easy as opposed to other industries where you need executives to actually know something and know some shit in order to run that, either the company and the economy goes bankrupt, which means that this specifically incentivizes corruption, meaning that a lot of the proceeds will not go to the people anyway, meaning you do not get the development opening opposition wants. But thirdly, for specifically the same reason of short-term cash influxes, this incentivizes bad political decision and short-term populist moves. Cash handouts like we see in Saudi Arabia and Nigeria, instead of paying back the debts that you took to build the extraction plan. It also means things like unprofitable public projects that you undertake in order to get short-term electoral points. Because even if this breeds harms in the long run, you're going to delegate it to a future government. Your short-term incentive, therefore your immediate and most proximate incentive, is winning the next electoral cycle. What this leads to, however, in the long term, is the debt crisis at the point where you do not pay off your outstanding debts, both for these projects, but also other debts that you have taken before, which leads to debt crises, which you cannot get out of, and which also stop you from borrowing more money that you need to service your economy. But secondly, it means in the long term, you increase the price of public utilities, you increase taxes and decrease wages in order to recoup the losses, which means the purchasing power of most of the people in the country falls and actually fall into poverty. This is particularly easy with resource economies, for particularly the reason that opening opposition says, because it's easy to access money and it's easy to access in the short term. And Geneva's argument on visibility specifically proves why you have this incentive to be corrupt or to make populist moves. But lastly, we just think that these industries are inherently vulnerable insofar as one, especially when you're undiversified, you're vulnerable to external shocks. No, things like the oil crisis in 73 and 79, which happened due to geopolitical events in other parts of the world, but this, however, influences the prices of your commodities, and if you do not have other opportunities and other things to sell, you're pretty much fucked. But secondly, resources are exhaustible, which means that they are only a short-term source of profit. And even if people have a time bias and don't think about it currently, this is going to be a problem in 10 years or 15 years. You do not want to base your economy on that. Why does this matter? Because we think that developing countries have alternatives, as Geneva conceded in Aditya's POI to her. It's one, cheap manufacturing. Countries like China use specifically that to develop. Know that you can protect this industry through things like tariffs and subsidies and make it more competitive, at least locally within the continent. But secondly, you can, insofar as it's cheap to produce goods like, textile and clothes and stuff like this, you can tailor the prices to the local economy, which means that within the level of the local economy, you can incentivize spending, increasing the purchasing power of the citizenry in general and generating tax revenue. But secondly, insofar as corporations are still going to come to these countries, not just for resources, but also for things like manufacturing, because they want to be able to be closer in terms of transportation to other countries in the continent, but also because the labor regulations are probably more lax. This means that they create supply networks because they have an incentive to cluster supply networks insofar as transportation costs are lower. They buy intermediary goods from local producers, but they also create microeconomies because workers from corporations are going to go to the local restaurant, to the local fruit shop, or the local free market, which increases the flow of money within the economy. But thirdly, developing countries are not just some backwater, there is urbanization within these places, even in authoritarian regimes. Not in Rwanda, who's one of the largest growing economies in Africa, you have clustering of educated people within megacities, which means you have a budding service sector and a budding IT sector. There is diversification. The comparatives, however, Geneva says, you can do both, but she provides no incentive as to why you would. Insofar as you are a corrupt government and you can literally rake in gold from digging things out of the fucking ground, there is no reason why you would finance high-cost industries that you haven't developed yet, and you lose more money in the short term than you would gain. At the point where you do not get the funds from the IMF to continue their corrupt projects, they have an incentive to diversify, because in the long term, this then becomes their next best option to continue getting that revenue. They do not have incentive on the opposition side of the house. This also immediately beats open government, because OG has no fiat to implement their alternatives. We explain both, one, why resource economies are uniquely bad and lead to corruption, two, why alternatives exist, and thirdly, why these alternatives are zero-sum with the current behavior of these regimes. And lastly, the rebuttal to Aditya is And the rebuttal to OG is very flimsy in terms of how manufacturing is hard. It's much more expensive to build an extraction plant, dig something, refine something, ship something, than to set up a fucking textile factory. It's a lower setup cost. We win that on our side of the house. But then let's talk about the alternatives and China. I think Aditya is just correct to point out that the IAAB is a development institution, and insofar as it is, opening opposition by the virtue of the motion has to stand for that as well. But even if not, we're going to prove why it's just a lot better than the West, which is why, despite Geneva's flimsy analysis of why they go to WTO, it's not true. 67 countries are a member of the BRI. There's a fucking good reason for that, and I'm going to explain why. But before that, I'm going to give a chance for opening opposition to defend themselves.
Look, when is Dutch disease more likely? When BP is pumping oil out of your country hard and fast and lobbying to deregulate your government, or the World Bank is slowly developing you and giving you experts in institution building?
One, they're lobbying anyway, because a lot of these projects are undertaken by corporations on your side of the house as well. Secondly, IMF conditionality, which is what I'm going to talk about, means that you get the same kind of pernicious deregulation on your side. Not that IMF loans come with conditionality, which is symmetric to China, by the way, but it's also worse. First of all, because the IMF pushes you to privatize your industries, which means that insofar as they're still undeveloped, they cannot compete on the global market, and you lose the proceeds from these very rare resources that opening opposition claims you have. Secondly, the IMF pushes for privatization of utilities like healthcare and education, which means that a huge amount of people within these countries cannot access them, which is not just a harm in and of itself, but also disincentivizes future development insofar as education matters. Thirdly, the IMF forces you to devalue your currency, which means that the purchasing power of the average citizen falls, which not only leads to poverty, but also harms the internal economy, which cannot generate revenue. But last, it creates anti-West sentiment, because insofar as it creates poverty, people do not want to liberalize the economy, even if it were good. Comparatively, China at least builds infrastructure. It electrifies countries like in Kenya. It builds ports, which means it builds supply networks. And even if you have to sell a port, it's better to sell a port for debt forgiveness than to go into a fucking debt crisis you cannot recover from in 20 years like Argentina, and cannot get other loans that you may need to service your economy because you have a fucking low credit rating. Secondly, China just has more money. It controls its SOEs and banks, so there's less risk involved, whereas the West is also dependent on political will to keep investing in developing countries. But thirdly, China just gives less conditions, because that's how they optically diversify from the West, as in, we are not imperialists, we're going to force you to privatize your economy, which means that the China is just a better alternative, and even if not, it's at least symmetric with the West in terms of how bad or how good it is, which means that the argument of, China is bad, is just stupid fear-mongering, which wouldn't happen in a top room. Closing government has won this debate.
Speaker for the speech, now member of all.
Can I just check that I'm audible?
Yes.
Okay, thanks. POIs in the chat, please. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Okay, engaging with OG, engaging with CG, and then giving you our extension, which is why this development is likely to trickle down to the people on the ground, and why that ultimately creates better conditions for the people living in these countries. OG, why is their counterfactual just unlikely? Look, how do the incentive structures of these organizations work? I think it's critical to understand this, because clearly if these types of programs that they talk about are out with those incentives, then they're unlikely to ever have funding for things like schools. Understand that these organizations rely on people being willing to fund them in the first place, which means that you have to realistically think that the programs that the IMF or the World Bank are launching are going to actually be successful, and that you have some chance of being able to have your loan paid back to you in the first place. I think we ask a POI to opening government as to why they think education is likely to appeal to this. And they say education is more tangible. This is ridiculous for two reasons. One, natural resources just are tangible because A, rich countries just have fucking coal now. And secondly, you're immediately able to generate some revenue and some income. That means you can immediately start to do things like paying back your loans. That is very short term, and that means that you can immediately see the success of these types of policies. But secondly, education just isn't tangible for two reasons. One, it's super long term. So, like it might be, well, the economy might be better in like 30 years once everyone who's gone through these new schools is like more educated now. But that's not something that necessarily appeals to your incentive, given that you probably want to be able to get back the money that you've given to those loans very, very quickly. But secondly, there's just no guarantee of success, right? There's no guarantee that the education program is necessarily going to be that successful, or that the people who come out of are going to lead to be amazing entrepreneurs who create loads of economic development within these countries. Insofar as that is the case, I think this seems like really, really risky, or just really, really inefficient investment. And so countries are just unwilling to fund these type of loans in the first place anyway. And so I just don't think that any of the stuff that opening government says is going to happen is actually going to happen in this debate. I think that's why they fall out of this debate. Note that we'll clash more with them in our extension when we explain why development does trickle down. Secondly, on CG, there are cases like you diversify your economy more, natural resource extraction is bad for a variety of reasons, and the alternative is like invest in manufacturing or whatever. Look, I just think it's very hard to be able to do the types of things that they're even talking about in the first place. Because understand that under the status quo, a lot of countries that would have to turn to things like natural resource extraction. The reason that the IMF would be willing to fund these types of industries in the first place is because they're probably the strongest industries that exist within these countries, right? I think the problem is to be able to set up other strong industries like a service sector or like a manufacturing sector is that you just need an initial capital inflow to be able to do that. And it's unclear why you ever necessarily get that, right? I think we accept that some harms probably exist, but we argue from closing opposition that you have to incur these harms in order to be able to get off the ground with these other industries in the first place. Take manufacturing, right? You just need resources to be able to do manufacturing. So insofar as you don't necessarily have the money to be able to import all of the resources that you would need to manufacture goods, or you can't produce those goods that you would want to manufacture yourself, then I'm unclear why it can exist without a natural resource extraction industry actually existing in the first place. But secondly, I'm just unclear why your manufacturing industry would ever be able to do things like competing with existing powers that already have access to things like economies of scale like China, who already have vastly greater access to the international market than you do, and who are vastly more established than you do and have better supply chains than you do. Like, I just don't understand why your manufacturing industry is ever likely to be something that you have a comparative advantage in, and therefore something that you're likely to be successful in launching off the ground. And I think that that means you're not necessarily being able to get the type of diversification that you talk about. But secondly, I think you just still have incentives to diversify on our side. Like, even if the only incentive of a corrupt government is to line their own pockets, A, I think you're capable of recognizing that resources aren't long-term sustainable, and B, you just want more money. I think the difference then in this debate is whether or not you have more capital and more existing infrastructure that you didn't have to pay for to help you do that in the first place. Meaning that I think countries are better at doing things like diversifying their economies on our side, given that they just have more money to be able to do that in a world where they have invested in those natural resources. Onto our extension, which is why specifically we create economic development that actually trickles down to the people. And note that we're going to clash with both opening and closing government here in terms of explaining why it is that even if the state takes all the money, it's still better. But B, why it is that the state probably doesn't take the money. We have 4 mechanisms for this. 1, I think you often just remove state control of industries, right? So opening and closing government are like, the state manages all these projects, so just takes all of the money. But I think it's important to note that in the case of the types of international development organizations that we're talking about here, like the IMF and the World Bank, it's like diametrically opposed to their interests, right? Like, their major goal is making the economies of developing nations more market orientated. This is a stated goal of things like structural adjustment programs. That means that you pass things like market freedom programs and involve things like privatization, deregulation, and the reduction of trade barriers, which means often, even if there were state-owned enterprises that control these resources initially, they probably don't control those industries in a world in which you have like taken those loans in the first place, because the conditions of those loans have forced you to do things like privatizing those industries. Then I think that does just mean that all of the stuff that they say about why it doesn't trickle down and why the state can just take all of the money doesn't necessarily exist, because insofar as that money goes to more like private companies in these nations, then it's much more likely to trickle down to all of the people who work for those companies, right? Second, I think you attract more FDI, right? And I think this is a consequence of 2 things. A, creating lower barriers to international trade, again, as a condition of taking these types of loans. But B, as a consequence of like building more infrastructure in these countries, right? I think you essentially become more attractive because you can actually do businesses in these countries when they can easily access the international market from them, but also when it's just much easier for you to do things like moving your goods and service around in them. I think this is beneficial for a couple of reasons. Like, 1, I think you get a lot of things like greenfield investments in these countries, which means that you directly do things like building factories, and these are things that can directly increase the level of production that happens in these countries, ultimately creating economic growth. But secondly, this is something that trickles down to the people at the bottom, because at the very least they can access better goods and better services in the first place when they just have more international companies who are there, who are willing to employ them, or who are willing to cater to their markets, and therefore do things like dropping their prices so people can access their goods. And and they have an incentive to do this so that they can access those markets. Third, I think you just still have an imperative to pay your workers, right? Because if you want your workers to work for you, or you want your workers to rebel against you, then presumably you still have to pay them something, right? Which is why even if you don't buy that, like privatization happens, I think it's still very likely that at least some money is trickling down to these individuals, and it's very likely more than they're being paid in the alternative world. I think the reason for that is that countries require financing in order to get these industries off the ground in the first place. I'll take OG very quickly.
CG's content on state regulation is symmetric because regulation exists independent of WTO investments. O gives us a lot of reasons why the WTO is good. This means states are forced to be less corrupt and reform on our side in order to gain access to that finance. That's a good impact.
Okay, thanks for telling me that CG was symmetric. Great. Cool. Don't care. I also just think that, like, realistically, it's not symmetric in terms of like whether you got like state regulation or privatization, because clearly insofar as you just take international development loans, and that's something that doesn't happen on the other side because they're not willing to fund any of the other industries because they wouldn't be able to produce a comparative advantage, and therefore don't have a particularly high success chance of being able to get you back your initial investment, then presumably it's not symmetric. Yeah. So yeah, you still pay your workers, right? And that just means there's more money floating through the economy. That means people can spend more money, and that means that businesses can do better because they have more money in the first place. Finally, just infrastructure development is something that does trickle down, right? Like you have much more investment in building roads, you have much more investment in building railways and airports because you have no other way of getting the coal out of your country. I think presumably then that's when things like manufacturing industries can also flourish too, because presumably you're building very similar infrastructures to do these things. I think then the difference is, do you have the money to be able to invest in those infrastructure developments in the first place? That is something that only happens in closing opposition.
All right, thanks for that speech. And now Government Whip.
Everyone hear me? Sorry.
Yeah.
Cool. It's a shame we only got responses to the first part of Tin's extension, because the second half of Tin's speech was spent telling you why, even if it is true that you get alternate investment, which is what OO spends the majority of their time trying to prove, that this is actively good. To wit, we heard literally no response from closing opposition. We won the debate very simply because we proved two things. One, it is actively better to transition yourself away from natural resources, and corrupt governments are unlikely to do this because they look at a cash cow and they say, why would I ever invest in literally anything else? And two, that if it is the case that you have alternate investment, that alternate investment is far better than the neoliberal agenda of the World Trade Organization, the World Bank, and the IMF. Three things in the speech. One, I want to deal with closing government, a team that mostly repeats like most of what you heard from opening opposition and adds in a little bit of chat about FDI and SOEs. Then I want to talk about opening opposition, why all their material about bad actors in development just makes no sense. Then opening government, why we largely come above them, despite the POI about our regulations that I actually literally don't know what the POI is about. One, closing government. The first thing to say here on responses to our extension was simple. That they say, one, it is very hard to do this. The IMF funds the strongest industries. But I don't think they understand the analysis that Tin is giving first place. Because the reason why these industries are strong in these countries is not because they were strong a priori and not because you can't do manufacturing a priori. Rather, I think the lessons of international development of places like Bangladesh, India, and China, Singapore, South Korea show that plenty of countries are able to industrialize with quite literally zero capital when they start out, just by heavily subsidizing their manufacturing industries and willing to take out loans as a result of that. The problem and the reason the IMF funds these industries right now is because they are the strongest industries right now. And the reason is because, as Tin explains, if you're a corrupt government, the excess returns you get out of investing in oil, diamonds, minerals is just so much more compared to the excess returns that you get off of investing in manufacturing, because there are far more labor costs and supply costs associated with manufacturing. The profits that you get are less relative to the massive profits that you engender when you invest in oil-rich economies. And that is exactly why, like, for example, Saudi Arabia is able to sustain its wealth purely off oil. So the reason the IMF funds these industries is because they're the only things that are there, and they're the reason that they're only things that are there is because countries are convinced that they are the path to development. But absent corrupt governments, knowing that they cannot get financing from things like the IMF, they are forced to otherwise diversify, which they would not have done otherwise, because their interest is in maximizing the total sum of money. To wit, closing opposition says, but you don't think that these things are stable in the long term and you can get more money about diversifying. No. If you have a limited amount of capital to invest in different sectors of the economy, you choose to invest in the thing that's going to get you personally 10x returns. It doesn't matter if resources are unstable in the long run, because the fact is that you can gender so much profit off of resources and build up such an accumulated wealth, i.e. like the vast majority of people in like Nigeria, like Good Luck Jonathan, that built up and siphoned off tons of money off of Nigeria's oil wealth, because he could afford to do so regardless of whether or not oil shocks happened, because the point was he had already built up so much wealth that it didn't matter if the oil shocks hit him, because he had already built up like so much wealth. You just can't do that with manufacturing. You literally cannot build up the same sorts of stores of wealth, which is why corrupt economies prefer investing in these things. The only way they are going to diversify is when you forcibly make them diversify. The last thing to say here is they say, oh, well, you need initial capital inflows and you need resources, and there are countries like China that do this. One, I think the point that they miss is that states that are establishing manufacturing economies don't want to remain as such. That is to say, they move on. China is no longer purely a manufacturing economy. It's like a service economy. That's why Bangladesh and other countries like that, like Vietnam, have become more manufacturing in the last 10 to 15 years because they see that as a viable path to development, and they offer the comparative advantage of being better than the earlier established countries. The last thing to say here about needing capital inflow is just this is ridiculous because like your comparative advantage is cheap labor. Businesses love that businesses love that and they're willing to invest lots of FDI. This I think also deals with the extension. They make the claim that you open yourselves up to FDI. You do this much more on our side of the house because you have to open up to FDI on our side of the house in order to open up your economy to manufacturing and MNCs, because absent that, you do not have resource money. So you need to open yourself up to FDI to get manufacturing, to get like investment in like your source of wealth. So think about like South Africa, for example, which has like found immense value in liberalizing in certain areas like Johannesburg, centralizing lots and lots of people there and building up internet service sector and manufacturing economies as a result of that. That is fantastic. To deal with the other parts of the extension, I think the SOE stuff is ridiculous. Because I think what Tin points out is the reason why SOEs are actively good in the vast majority of these places, even if they siphon off some amount of corrupt wealth, it does not matter. Because the implication of like SOEs in places like India and China is as a result, when they control your natural resources, they can afford to set prices low. When you have foreign countries that come in and control your resources, because by the way, in response to opening opposition's POI about BP and the World Bank, that is exactly what the World Bank does. It liberalizes your economy so BP can take over your resources. That is terrible because it means that BP sets the prices for the average individual. So when the average individual experiences some sort of oil shock, the state is willing to take a cost to lower oil prices so people can literally afford to feed themselves and don't starve and can heat their homes in the winter. All of that seems good. The last stuff on infrastructure is symmetric with our material about China. It's symmetric with our material about manufacturing, and it's pretty derivative from opening opposition. Opening opposition, they tell you two things. One, about development. Two, about bad actors. The first thing to say about development is diversification just works. The second thing to say is that it massively reduces corruption because it is harder to target lots of diversified economies and say, we want to extract rent from all these things. Can explain to you why it's comparatively easier to do this in the cases of oil or mineral. The third thing to say is that this reduces corruption because there are just less excess reserves. So you have to engage in actively good politics and actively good economics rather than rely on corruption to maintain your power.
Uganda is developing, like you say, under both resources and manufacturing currently, because it is possible. But if they don't have incentive to do both, why do they now, when other actors will still step in, well, worse, who do things like require them giving up sovereignty, giving up land,
other
buying
actors,
labor?
There is literally no plausible material from opening opposition why other actors are worse. I want to take you through this. The LO says there's conditionality, the local population, and there's singular political interests. All these are symmetric at best and much worse on their side. The singular political interest is just crudely asserted that the interests of countries in the world, like the World Bank, balance them out, but that's not at all clear that that's true. Tin is the one who tells you why China's singular political interest is actively good. That is to say they are consistent with funding rather than having oscillating funding. The local population stuff is silly. If Western MNCs make if the West liberalizes the country and imports like Western MNCs, you have imports of those people anyway. Conditionality, Tin beats this. Look, I want to posit to you something very quickly. On bad actors, I think they lost the debate because Tin is the only one in the round who points out that under Western countries and Western development institutions, you are much more likely to not get debt forgiveness in exchange for taking a port or two, but instead to be roped into decades-long financial crises that imperil the ability of you to run your economy, which has much realer harms on developing nations than the taking of one port. Opening opposition is out, and we beat them far better than opening government did, which is why we come over OG as well. Very proud to propose.
Cool, thanks for that speech. And now opposition whip.
Great. Am I audible?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Things in this speech. First OG, then CG, maybe OO if I have some time. Because look, let's deal with CG, because I think OO has done this fairly effectively, but I think everyone's realized that they hinge on this very weird counterfactual that they maybe prove possibility, but they just do not prove probability. I think OO have always proved to you why the World Bank doesn't necessarily give out grants. But look, let's say even if they do, and let's say the OG is right and they do give out grants like the Bill Gates Foundation, there's a couple of things. One, this clearly only goes to very few countries out there. They don't just infinitely give out loads and loads of grants. But secondly, I just think they are also therefore quite rare. So even if this is the case where grants is an alternative, this This is clearly not an alternative for the vast majority of developing countries. And therefore, if we want to impact the most people, this isn't necessarily an alternative we should support. But I think also, secondly, why is this therefore likely to be rare? I think Jamie already tells it. These types of institutions are funded by countries like the US and the EU that don't like giving their money away all the time. They are not charities themselves. They have their own domestic population and their own electoral incentives in order to make sure they're not just seen as giving away all their money. I think they get very angry every time they have to give out a loan. I think it's seen as very domestically unpopular, and therefore they want to see their returns on these loans and they want to see money back. And often, therefore, these are not grants in the first place. These are therefore loans that need to have some sort of tangible benefits. They say, oh, education is more tangible. You can't see the profits of mining. Jamie shows you why this isn't the case, in the sense that education is super long term and secondly, no guarantee to success. I think it's especially important within developing countries when there's often things like poverty or gender roles, which mean that often one, women are unable to access education in the first place, but two, I think often even the men of these families have to drop out of education at about 12 or 14 in order to support their family and work. Therefore, even if this was a scenario, I'm not necessarily sure why this is a beneficial trade-off. I'm not sure why this necessarily or guarantees to lead to economic development. I think at this point, that when we prove there is no trade-off in the first place, and therefore OG have no benefits, I think they're already out in this debate. But secondly, then, let's just talk about the harms that OG talk about, because they want to say that this will just pop up regime governments. However, the point which they never prove to that why they never get alternative fundings and why there will never be other ways to pay their elites, that there's just not a unique harm to any side of the house. I think these corrupt governments will remain on either side of the house. I'm not necessarily sure to what extent they're stronger. I'm not sure what the tipping point is. They never quantify these impacts. The point at which all sides seem to concede that there are alternative sources of funding. I'm unclear, therefore, why this is necessarily the tipping point in order for them to no longer pay their elite. But secondly, they go, we just never see this money because governments are corrupt. This is just lazy argumentation. I think Jamie shows you why there's just literally no incentive for these governments to just take all the money themselves, at the point at which that one, they probably won't get alternative loans in the future when they got, like, the World Bank doesn't see this money. But secondly, like, if you just don't pay your workers, it's very unlikely that they're ever going to turn up to work in the first place. But secondly, if you don't do things like invest in perhaps things like healthcare, and you don't have a productive workforce that can't show up for work and be healthy, then you're never going to generate that profit and generate that revenue in the first place. Therefore, clearly, even in instances where they maybe skim some money off the top, this is clearly not taking all the money. I think it's quite a ridiculous characterization. It's just quite frankly lazy. But therefore, I think the point at which we get some economic development, there's still a benefit on our side from opposition bench. I think that then thirdly and finally they go, okay, even if there are benefits, these only go to the people that live nearby that can afford to be the miners that work there, essentially. I think this is not true, and I think Jamie talks about a lot of the trickle-down economic benefits of this when they talk about how, one, you're probably going to have some increase in public spending, or any public spending at all, the point at which you have an incentive to have the economically productive workforce that actually shows up for work and can actually generate revenue. Secondly, the point at which you build roads in the future, that makes up other cities and towns are all better connected. People can travel for other businesses and can set up shops in different locations. Thirdly, if you get things like FDI, that's clearly going to have trickle-down effects. You're going to hire other workers in other nearby areas. And fourthly, if you have to force countries to do things like liberalize their trade, there's clearly just economic benefits that generate to some degree, and there is clearly some trickle-down effect. And therefore, even that they're not just benefiting those that live near the farm, I think there's also, therefore, on the comparative, far less harms on op side. Therefore, the point at which OG has no benefits and barely any harms, I think they are just out of this debate. And I think that is fairly clear. Okay, then dealing with CG, because I think CG makes some reasons as to why this type of development is pretty shit. Firstly, when they talk about incentivizing corruption. One, at the point at which these countries are already very corrupt, I'm unclear why there's necessarily the tipping point. I'm not sure how much worse this gets. I think if you're already a corrupt government, I don't think why you can incentivize people further. I think at the point at which you are corrupt anyway, there's always going to be an incentive to be more corrupt. I think people just like having more money. Therefore, I'm unsure why this is actually the tipping point. But secondly, I'm also unclear why this is unique to natural resources, because I feel that these types of benefits they tell you about having short-term cash influx is just not, it just applies to any form of development or FDI or loan that gives you a short-term cash influx. I'm not necessarily sure why natural resources is the only unique mechanism as to give these governments any form of inflow of cash, whether this be from a charity grant, whether this be from NGO. I think any of these incentives to pump in money is going to have this incentive to exist. I'm not sure why this is necessarily unique to natural resources. But then finally dealing with the alternatives, because they just say that one, it is better to develop other sectors of your economy. Maybe this is true. However, they do not necessarily show why these countries have the capacity to do so in the first place, because it is just clearly very, very difficult to just build up a manufacturing center when, one, these countries just lack comparative advantage in other sectors. Why? Because they often have infant industries, which means they're never going to be able to compete with countries like China or even India or Bangladesh or any of the countries they discuss. The point in which they have just economies of scale, they have a huge amount of workforce, and they have a well-developed economy. It is unclear why these countries are ever going to be able to compete enough to make a profit. Maybe these countries are moving on to other things like services. But China's manufacturing industry is still enormous and still will be for the foreseeable future. I am unclear why they are ever going to overcome these pre-existing things of economies of scale when they're always going to do things like offer goods at lower prices. But also, secondly, when you have things like no skilled workforce and you're very limited infrastructure, I'm unclear why it's necessarily able to produce other forms of service. I think also, thirdly, when you lack the capital and the FDI to ever invest in the first place, let's just point out, like, developing a manufacturing industry is clearly very expensive. There's clearly huge amounts of competition. They just name some countries where this works. However, they do not give me any structural reasons as to why these countries have the capacity to successfully do this in the first place and be able to compete on a global market. I think it's also unclear why the existence to do this only exists on their side. I think especially when CG argues that natural resources are so profitable, I don't know why states don't just prioritize just financing their natural resources projects themselves. I think the point of which they can invest in manufacturing by themselves without any form of loans, I'm unclear why they just instead choose to invest in natural resources and why it's necessarily you are dependent on these types of loans to ever invest in your natural resources to begin with. I think clearly they have to have a great amount of capital to set up a new manufacturing industry, as the costs are still really, really high, given you need to, 1, buy resources to manufacture with, 2, build factories, 3, build expensive machinery, 4, build roads and infrastructure. The cost of setting up each industry isn't really that different. I think CG is entirely uncomparative. The point in which you can invest in a manufacturing, you can also invest in natural resources. Therefore, the point at which there is that incentive to build that intense amount of wealth, I'm unclear why that is necessarily changes on their side. Because look, I think if there is ever the incentive to build up a manufacturing industry, I think that, 1, at least we give the capacity to do so. And I think at least we make it better. I think if countries ever have an incentive to build a manufacturing industry, then CG can see they have some long-term incentive. Therefore, I'm not sure why they would not do this when they have even greater capacity to do so and better ability to compete. Therefore, I think for all those reasons, CO.
Great, thanks for that speech. Thanks everyone for that debate. This round is open, right?
Yeah, I think so.
All right, so if y'all could just head back into the main hall and then we'll call you back in 10 to 15.
Thanks, everyone.